Hello! The divine language argument attempts to establish the existence of God by arguing that our conscious experience of reality actually constitutes a language. According to George Berkeley, the idealism guy, our sense experience is a special, universal language that God uses to communicate information about the physical world to mankind. This argument can be divided into two parts. Firstly, the argument attempts to establish that experience of the world around us actually does qualify as a language. This is a weird way to think about our senses, but surprisingly, there are deep similarities between our sense experience and human languages. Secondly, the argument tries to show that this language of experience points to a divine mind communicating with us, much in the same way that human language points to the existence of a human mind communicating with us. For this presentation, I'm drawing heavily upon the article Semantic Compositionality and Berkeley's Divine Language Argument by Todd DeRose. Now, before further explaining this argument in more depth, I'm going to briefly mention an odd quirk about this argument's history. In Berkeley's original presentation of the argument, he focuses on one of the senses in particular, vision. He argues that our visual experiences constitute a language which points to God. Putting a spotlight on this specific sense has led some to suggest that even if Berkeley's argument was super compelling, it would be completely useless when talking to someone who's blind. That's interesting, I guess. But fortunately, the version of the argument we're looking at today works for sense experience more broadly. If the argument goes through, then touch, taste, smell, hearing, as well as vision are all going to be part of the language of experience. Now, with that out of the way, why think our sense experience actually constitutes a language? Well, the difficulty in answering is that there is no agreed upon definition of language. So instead, the argument merely highlights a bunch of similarities between what we normally think of as languages and our sense experience. So any good definition of language that includes the standard stuff like English, French, Russian, and so on, the human languages, will probably include sense experience as well. The more similarities we can draw between the language of experience and standard human languages, the stronger the argument becomes. So here's 10 properties shared between the language of experience and human languages. 1. Generativity. How many different concepts can be expressed by the English language? Well, infinitely many. A language can be used to describe limitless ideas because there are limitless ways to combine words together. Likewise, the language of experience can express infinitely many concepts because there are limitless ways to combine experiences. To illustrate, there's essentially no limit to the number of English books that can be written because you could always come up with more combinations of English words. And analogously, there's essentially no limit to the number of images you can experience because you could always come up with more combinations of colors. 2. Productivity. When you see a word that you've never encountered before, you may need to look it up in a dictionary. But when you see a sentence that you've never encountered before, there's a good chance you're able to piece together what it means based on your understanding of the words and their arrangement. Likewise, every day we experience things that we have never experienced before, but we can still understand what the experiences mean. To illustrate, you've probably never heard the sentence, "My pet giraffe is covered in purple paint." However, you still know what that sentence means because you understand what the words mean and how they're arranged. Likewise, you probably have never experienced seeing a giraffe covered in purple paint, but if you did, you'd probably be able to figure out what you were looking at by understanding what purple paint looks like and how it's arranged in the shape of a giraffe in your visual field. 3. Systematicity. Sometimes understanding one English sentence guarantees understanding a related English sentence. Likewise, understanding what we experience guarantees an understanding of similar experiences. To illustrate, if you understand the sentence, "the cat is on the mat," then you probably understand "the mat is on the cat." Likewise, if you understand a visual experience of an image of a cat on a mat, you probably understand the very similar image of a mat on a cat. 4. Interchangeability. The particular words that make up the English language could have been different. We could have called fire by some other word, like Brissinger, and the English language would have worked just as well. Likewise, the particular sensations we experience could have been different and still conveyed the same understanding. To illustrate, fire is visually represented to us in the language of experience by a bright yellowish-orange color in a particular shape. However, someone in the classic color inversion thought experiment might see a bright purplish color in the same shape and associate that with fire. So, the exact representation of fire isn't important as long as it's consistent. 5. Displacement. The English language can convey information about something very far away in space or very far back in time. You don't need to point at something to be able to talk about it. Likewise, the language of experience can communicate information to us about topics that are incredibly displaced from us. To illustrate, we can learn about the past through the language of experience by looking at fossils, and we can learn about distant things by looking through telescopes. 6. Superficiality. Some argue that it's possible to understand what a sentence is conveying without thinking about the definition of each individual word in that sentence. Likewise, it's possible for a complex experience to convey something without thinking about every component of that experience. To illustrate, if you saw a messy room, you could understand that the room is messy without consciously considering how each individual object is positioned haphazardly. 7. Resilience. If an English sentence is missing a single letter or word, it's often possible to infer what the missing piece is based on context. Likewise, if a portion of our experience is missing, it can still easily be inferred. To illustrate, if you knew what every side of a table looked like except its underside, you might still be able to infer what it looked like. 8. Multimodality. English can be written or spoken. It can be conveyed through many mediums. Likewise, we can experience something through multiple mediums. To illustrate, we can see what a table looks like, but we could also feel the table's texture. The table can be communicated to us via multiple mediums. 9. Translatability. Languages can be translated into other languages. English can be translated into French, and vice versa. Likewise, we can translate the language of experience to human languages, albeit imperfectly. To illustrate, one might think that the visual experience of seeing a turtle jump can be translated to the English sentence, "the turtle jumped." 10. Plainness. You don't need to be a scholar or a linguist to be able to speak English. It doesn't require extensive academic study and systematization to be able to understand. And likewise, we don't need to get our PhD in the 5 senses or something before we can understand our own experiences. And that's the end of our list. You could probably come up with more similarities, but I think that's pretty thorough for our purposes here. There are quite a few properties that human languages and sense experience have in common. By the way, I made up the names for most of the properties on that list. Generativity, productivity, and systematicity are actually used in the literature, and I wanted to have a cool name for every property, so I tried to choose something appropriate. Now, some have objected that our sense data has certain characteristics that make it disanalogous to human languages. Let's look at 4 properties that language is supposed to have, but our sense experience allegedly lacks. 1. Bidirectionality. Languages are used for two-way communication. However, the language of experience is not used for two-way communication. It's used by God to talk to us, and we can't respond in that language. So it isn't really a language at all. What can the proponent of the argument say in response to this objection? Well, one possible response is that God directly experiences everything that happens in the physical world. So any action in the physical world makes God experience something. In that case, everyone is in constant two-way communication with God. Arguably, humans even talk to other humans in the language of experience because we make other humans experience things all the time. Alternatively, perhaps humans simply lack the power to respond in the language of experience, but this doesn't make it impossible to do so. Perhaps God could create, or even has created, a spirit with the power to speak to him directly in the language of experience, but we simply aren't such beings. So the language of experience isn't itself one-directional, we're just mute. Finally, a specifically Christian response is that God is a Trinity, so the different persons of the Trinity could speak to each other in the language of experience, even if no creature could. 2. Structure. What stops you from deciding that the word stop actually means go? Well, there are rules about how you should interpret the English language. But there are no such rules when it comes to the language of experience. English words have set definitions, but you could assign whatever meanings you wanted to your experiences, so there's not enough assigned structure in your experiences to constitute a language. What can the proponent of the argument say in response to this objection? Well, first, what actually stops you from deciding stop means go? Pragmatic reasons, mostly. If you decided to never stop at stop signs, because they're actually go signs, you'd get pulled over or get in an accident. Plus, you'd constantly confuse people in normal conversations. The most pragmatic thing to do is define the word stop like everyone else. The language of experience is actually pretty similar. What if you decide the visual image of a fire actually meant water? Well, you'd burn yourself trying to take a drink. So, just as there are pressures that force you to structure your use of the English language in a certain way, there are pressures that force you to structure your use of the language of experience in a certain way. 3. Truth aptitude. Sentences can be true or false. The ability to say things that are true or false is fundamental to languages. But since data can't be true or false, you just experience it. So since data can't be a language, what can the proponent of the argument say in response to this objection? Well, a simple response would be that any illusions or hallucinations count as false experiences, but experiences that accurately tell us about the physical world are true experiences. A problem with this answer is that any time someone hallucinates, God would be communicating something false to that person. But God doesn't lie. So you may need a slightly more complicated interpretation to avoid this problem. Like maybe the language of experience reports to us the data that our body has gathered. And whenever a hallucination or an illusion occurs, this is because something is messing with the data gathering process. So, God truthfully communicates to us, here is the data that your body has acquired, even if your body hasn't done a very good job. Another point is that only sentences can be true or false. Individual words or groups of words can be perfectly meaningful without expressing something true or false, such as, my pet giraffe. Perhaps our sense data is communicating something more like words or groups of words rather than sentences, so the experiences are not in fact true or false, but nonetheless a language. 4. Humanness. This is the oddest objection to the divine language argument, but it is an objection that has actually been raised. Look, all language is used by humans to communicate with other humans, but the language of experience is between God and humans, so they are disanalogous. What can the proponent of the argument say in response to this objection? Well, it just begs the question. The divine language argument is trying to show that there is actually a language that God uses to communicate with humanity. So this objection only works if we've already decided that the argument fails. But if we've already decided that an argument fails, it's too late to object to it. Okay, so now that we've looked at some reasons to think that our sense experience actually does constitute a language of experience, how do we get to theism? Well, the argument largely rests on analogous reasoning. If you heard someone communicate to you in the English language, it would be reasonable to infer that there was an intelligent mind at the other end of that communication. Likewise, receiving information in the much greater language of experience indicates that a much greater mind is communicating with you. This has the interesting implication that God is constantly communicating with all of us nonstop. The problem, though, is that there are other explanations for the existence of the language of experience. For example, maybe a naturalist could say that our own subconscious is getting data from our body, and then it communicates that data to our conscious minds through the language of experience. Furthermore, naturalists are already committed to unguided evolution producing things that are very language-like, such as DNA. So plausibly, naturalists would not be impressed by the force of this argument from analogy. However, the proponent of this argument may possess a response. They can invoke the problem of other minds. See, the problem is that even in the case of a human communicating in English, it's equally possible to come up with alternatives to the existence of an intelligent mind behind that communication. Maybe solipsism is true, and you're the only human who actually possesses a mind, and everyone else is a mindless automata. The point of bringing up this problem is that insofar as we're allowed to infer the existence of human minds from human language, despite alternative explanations, it's equally justified to infer the existence of a mind behind the language of experience, despite alternative explanations. Instead of addressing head-on why theism best explains the existence of the language of experience, the proponent of this argument can simply say, hey, we're all cool with the inference of human minds from human language, right? Well, coolio. Well, my inference isn't any worse than that. So, the divine language argument concludes that believing in the existence of God is going to be as justified as believing in the existence of other minds. Anyways, that's the divine language argument. I personally don't think it's the strongest argument for the existence of God, but its structure is super unique. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed that video, and I'll see you in the next one.